I think that's my cue, and true to form, I've asked everyone in the audience to move up, and they have mostly. I guess it's too late for me to really single anybody out to move up. But I want to welcome you to the United States District Court for the Eastern District of Michigan's Power Act program for 2022. And I'm going to introduce the presenters in just a moment, but I thought, I don't know if the presenters know all the kind of instrumental people in our court. And Judge Cox, you'll know, that means they've run the court and we just kind of follow their judgment.
I know that very well.
First among them is Kanikia Essex, who is our court administrator of what, 1 year and 2 years?
Wow.
That's what, 1 year and 8 months. And she's doing a great job. And then we have our another court unit executive, Tony Marola, who got a dog during the pandemic. And he gave me a picture of the dog, which was totally unnecessary. I could, visualize just fine on my own. And he is our probation chief. And we have another, we have a pretrial chief, Patty Trevino. And they are a pair because she's also in the photo with this dog. Kim Grimes, well, let's see. Yeah, Kim Grimes is our operations person. She's in charge of the case managers for the judges and operations. She's the one step down from operations. We have a new deputy of operations. Is that right? Is that what they're called? Okay, and then we also have a deputy court services, right? Is that what it's called, Mike?
Court administration.
Court administration, deputy of court administration, which means everything that doesn't have a case number on it, he does. Is that fair?
Fair enough.
Okay. And Mike also has been in charge of our COVID information. And, we are anonymous, so we do our contact tracing by sending out a message saying, this person got a positive test and here's where they went. And I couldn't figure why everybody was asking me if I felt better. And because it's anonymous, but it said that the person went to the judge's parking lot and then they came up to room, I forget what's my room number, something on 2. And they went in a courtroom on 2, and I was like, yeah, giveaway was me, right? So anyway,
Yeah.
I'm lucky to have been one of the people with, toward the end, we help with very few symptoms, but he helps us make sure that if you are in the path, you know to test yourself, okay? So we really appreciate that. He could report less often, but
I agree.
it's okay. We'll introduce a few other people. Joining Kim Grimes, did I say your name before? Yes. On the first row is Sikna Chami, and she went to the first row because she knows that I would ask her to come up front. And she's in charge of our jury room, and they have done everything from have us pick juries in 2 different rooms. We had the grand jury set up in a, without giving away any secrecy, in a room like this. How about that? Yes. And spaced apart. We were able to pick them using 2 courtrooms. And now we're down to people picking in their own courtroom, right? But they have a rest period usually in another courtroom. Who am I leaving out?
John.
Huh? John Purdy? No, I'm going to get to him. I thought that I saw Patty come in, but that wasn't right. Okay. John Purdy is in charge of the court reporters, and I like him. And the reason,
Right there.
The reason I like him is because I gave up having a permanent one before I became a senior judge. And he manages to give me great people. They never complain. They never say, how long are we going to be here, Judge? any of that stuff, you tell him ahead of time not to say that.
Right.
And, but he's very good at making sure somebody is there to help me. And he also can find somebody if at the end of the day, after the clerk's office closes, you need someone, he can drum them up pretty well. So I thank him too. Now, who have I left out? Crystal Flood, wave your hand. She is in charge of having put on this program for 3 years, or all 4. This is our 4th year. Okay, our 4th year, and Judge Cox has been in with us since the beginning.
I think so.
So we really appreciate that. And we've done it twice by video or by Zoom, and then one time at Wayne County Community College, and then here, and we're going to think about doing it somewhere special later on. Hopefully out in, I'm going to get this wrong. I hope I'm not politically correct. I think in the program it says Indian country, but that's what we're going to try to do. Is that the appropriate thing to say?
Yes.
Okay, good. All right, great. And she also is responsible for making sure we have snacks. At 3:30, a Snickers and a Coke are required. If you all want to get a snack, we'll let you. There are all kinds of chips and Cheez-Its and some very big cookies and water, and I think there are even some soft drinks over there. So those of you who are having to sit up front, you can also go do that at your leisure. I don't think anybody will mind. And then I think that is that Judge Roberts in the back? Judge Victoria Roberts is one of our judges, also senior like me now. Don't say that. It doesn't have anything to do with age. That's what I keep telling you. Okay, we don't. That's I don't use it. Okay, well, there is Judge Victoria Roberts, district judge of our court. Did any other judges come in and I just missed them? No? Okay. All right, great. Anybody else want to be introduced?
Charlene.
I'm sorry?
Charlene.
Oh, Charlene did come in while I wasn't looking. I'm sorry? Charlene is my judicial assistant. And if you want to know where I am or what I'm doing, and I'm not sitting in my chair or on my bench, she knows exactly where that is at all times. So my mother even has her telephone. So I appreciate her. She does a lot of work all the time. Okay, so we're here for the Power Act presentation, and you all should know that the Power Act is an acronym for pro bono work to empower, and the pro bono Work to Empower and Represent Act of 2018. And Congress passed it on September 4th, and its primary goal is for United States district courts to partner with local, tribal, or territorial domestic abuse service providers and local to enhance the involvement of volunteer lawyers and to promote pro bono legal services as a way of empowering survivors of domestic violence, sexual assault, and stalking, and to engage citizens in assisting those survivors. And our programs, I think, have been mainly informational for people who come and want to get involved in some way in helping the survivors of domestic violence or stalking. So I thank you for coming here today. I want to just quickly introduce them because there's some bios back there on the table and programs. I don't know, did any of you pick up a program when you came in? Okay, I'm going to ask, Crystal's going to pass some of them out. The bios are wonderful, and I want you to know that I mentioned that Judge Melissa Ann Cox, who is a judge of the Domestic Relations Division. Are you the head of the division?
Effective last August, yes,
Okay,
yes.
I thought so, okay. And for the Wayne County Circuit Court, and also known as the 3rd Judicial Circuit Court, where she was elected in November of 2016, is that right?
That is.
Okay, so it wasn't long after you were elected that you came to visit us at one of these programs.
Yep.
And she has had a long history of working in the firm in the domestic violence area and also working for some city governments around the state. She was also named as a super lawyer, rising star for the past 6 years, and has been named by Our Magazine as a top female attorney. She resides in Wayne County with her husband and 3 children, and she's actively involved in her community and the legal community. She is a member of the Wayne County Family Bar Association, the Incorporated Society of Irish American Lawyers, and serves as the vice president of the Livonia Bar Association. And I'm going to let her say anything else she'd like to say about herself when she makes her presentation. Next to her is Rory Krantz, and he graduated from Thomas Cooley Law School, cum laude. And I think that's great. I admit that I did not graduate cum laude, although I wish I had. But he's been a prosecutor for 24 years, 11 in the state and 13 with the United States Attorney's Office in Bay City in the branch office. We call them divisional offices if it's the court. So we have 1 judge and 1 magistrate judge up in Bay City. And I've been up there several times, and they have a nice courtroom up there and parking. I don't say that very loudly around here, but they do have parking. And there's a great little restaurant across the street, or at least there used to be. And his primary focus is prosecuting defendants who physically and sexually abuse women and children in Indian country. And he has won an award for his work, the Director's Award from the Attorney General of the United States of America for superior performance in Indian country, and he was named Prosecutor of the Year for the state of Michigan in 2006 by the Michigan Arson Prevention Committee and the International Association of Arson Investigators. Here's a fun fact about him I liked. It said, and I had to read this twice, it said that he is an avid cyclist and runner that logs 5,000 to 6,000 miles per year. When I first read that, I said, well, that's not that many steps, right? And then I said, oh, it doesn't say steps, it says miles. And I was like, oh my goodness. And so he is a very active person and has been in several prestigious races. I hope you'll tell us a little bit about those 2. And Ashley Lowe and I go back a long time. And Ashley Lowe and I think, started working together on a state planning body when you were at U of M.
I think I was even at Oakland Livingston Legal Aid.
You know what? That's right, you were. That's a little farther back than I was going to go.
Right. I was only 8 years old.
She is an active member of the Access to Justice community in the state. And right now she is the Chief Executive Officer at Lakeshore Legal Aid, and there was a little blurb about Lakeshore Legal Aid and their work in your program, and so I hope you'll take a look at that. She's done a number of things. One of them I know is being active in the domestic violence area for over 20 years, and she's also taught. She is the associate director, or has been the associate director of the clinical education program at Wayne State's Law School, and she taught at Western Michigan University, Thomas and Cooley Law, and where she directed a family law assistance program. Is that correct? Assistance project.
Project, right.
Yeah. And so she's been very active, and she's going to bring us a PowerPoint presentation, which is why she's down there on the end. But I welcome each of them. They're going to make presentations, and then we're going to have a chance to ask them some questions, okay? All right, Judge Cox.
Would you like us at the podium, or can everyone hear fine? Okay. All right. Well, I don't have much to update on my personal bio, though it is outdated. I hardly get around to updating that. So I have 4 children, actually, And it's probably my fun fact. I was elected in November of 2016 and found out I was expecting my fourth before I took the bench in January. So she turns 5 tomorrow and would feel very slighted if I didn't add her to the bio. So that is my only update amidst a lot of other fun professional endeavors in the Wayne County Circuit Court. Last August, Chief Kenny did appoint me as presiding in the family division. And it's been a very exciting but difficult time with everything that's gone on. We're all tired of talking about COVID, but I think there's, the reality is we address everything as pre-COVID and now after COVID. So a lot of what I have to say about the Wayne Circuit Court and how domestic violence impacts us in our cases will have a lot to do with sort of where we are at within the pandemic. Thank you to everyone for having me again, to Judge Hood and Crystal and all the administration for putting this together. I practiced family law for almost 10 years before I became a judge in the Domestic Relations Division. And if I had to give a percentage on how many cases it impacts, it'd certainly be greater than 50%. So it is pervasive and it impacts every member of the family. And if it is not for us coming together collectively to bring together the resources, there's no chance at ever making a dent in the problem or finding any solution. So I really find that these events, the power that it brings to have everybody together and talk about things really is the only way that we are able to really, really help people in these situations. So thank you again for not only inviting me, but for putting this on every year. I'm very proud to say that the Third Circuit Court really has a true passion and commitment to making sure that survivors and victims of domestic violence have the resources that they need within our court system. We have always had a domestic violence and PPO, a domestic violence specialized division, and also a PPO courtroom that is a specialized courtroom in our court. So the volume that we receive from personal protection orders has been so great that creating its own court was really the only way that we felt the attention could be given specifically to those cases. If a case has another case assigned with it, such as a divorce or custody or any other case involving the same parties, that specific PPO does get reassigned to that judge so that we make sure we are implementing a one court, one family plan as it relates to all the issues that are seen within those families. Right now, we are working on a very, very long-awaited goal of bringing our juvenile division together with our domestic relations division as well. So every court in Michigan has a unified family court. Wayne County does not. And the biggest problem that we've had preventing us from doing that would be obviously our volume, being one of the biggest courts in the United States, certainly Michigan. And the location of our buildings, our juvenile court is located separately. So we've been working with the county to get a location that puts us all together so that we can unify the divisions, which would mean that any juvenile case, any parental rights termination would also be heard by the same judge as a PPO or a divorce. And so I think that is really important, and that's a big project that we have over the next probably 5 years. However, when the pandemic struck in 2020, the court shut down overnight, much like everything else, and the PPO courtroom did not. So we collectively decided with the 11 judges in the Domestic Relations Division that it just was not an option. So we remained working and we just took turns coming downtown and processing PPOs day in and day out until the second problem happened, and that was the closing of the clerk's office. So then virtually overnight, from April 19th to April 20th, we created an email system to allow PPOs to be filed anywhere virtually, remotely. And we did not even have a 24 hours pass that we were without a PPO courtroom. So we have kept that email system because we have found that the access to justice has just really allowed more people to achieve the protection that they need. And we have continued to operate the PPO courtroom both remotely and for filing purposes through an email system. And it's worked very well. And the increase in petitions and litigation in that courtroom has certainly demonstrated that. We will receive anywhere between 75 and 100 PPOs a day. and they get processed through the clerk's office, sent directly to the PPO room director, and then reviewed by the judge, and a decision is made within 24 hours. So we have been able to maintain that sort of precision with the process since the court shut down in 2019. However, what has been very clear, and in kind of reading the statistics to know that, I was right in what I'm saying, the increase in domestic violence has been an unintended consequence of the shutdown and the measures that we've taken to protect everyone from COVID-19. And even back in 2019 or 2020 rather, and 2021, when it truly was the scariest thing that many, many people have ever experienced, there were so many people living with a great bigger danger, and that was in a home where they were locked down, where violence was occurring regularly. Not only were they virtually locked in with the violence, they were cut off from the outside world and any resources, any survival resources that were available. So I read from many different sources that the increase across the world has been 20 to 33% in domestic violence increasing. It's not only the fact that people were locked in together, but the risk factors were skyrocketing. So stresses, anxieties, mental health issues, all of these things that cause an increase in domestic violence were also increasing. So we essentially had a decrease in resources available and an increase in all of the risk factors. And it has just created a devastating effect. And I'm sure that these two will tell you many more statistics about that, but it has been harrowing. It's been difficult. And we are looking for new ways to provide more resources now that we understand the secondary impacts of what the shutdown has done within families. So that has been the single most difficult thing we have dealt with in the court, is trying to keep up with the volume and assist people. The remote proceedings has helped not only for access. If someone doesn't show up, we can call them on the telephone and they can show up very quickly. If there is an issue with getting to court, that's remedied by the Zoom proceedings. Another huge issue is not having to be in the room again with the perpetrator or with the respondent. I mean, just the safety of feeling, removed and just in a different place than the respondent has been huge. One of the first weeks that I served on the PPO docket in 2017, I had the courtroom when it was in person was just the busiest courtroom for sure in the building. And Fridays were the motion calls and the trials. And I had a guy that I had arraigned a couple days before who was violating a PPO, and they have to be tried within 72 hours if you don't give a cash bond. So he's back on Friday. And somehow he had determined that the petitioner was there within the building, and he was sitting in the courtroom while other cases were being heard, texting the petitioner, who was on another floor, threatening her that if she testified, very bad things would occur. So one of the deputies let me know that that was happening and that she was too afraid to come down. So I figured, I would handle this contempt issue before calling the actual trial. And when he came forward and I asked him to see his phone, he threw it at me from the audience. So it didn't hit me, it hit the podium and made a big dent in it. And so, you can just see if that's happening, how horrified and terrifying it is for a victim of domestic violence to come in, for what is essentially reckoning day for the respondent and feel comfortable testifying and sharing all of these horrible details as to what's happened with regards to violence in that relationship. So, just an example of the way that, for better or for worse, Zoom has really assisted us to help these victims and petitioners in the PPO courtroom. I think, even though we have been able to establish these processes that have really helped people, the clerk's office has partnered with Michigan Legal Help to allow a really seamless process for forms for petitions. We have advocates who are back in person now, but worked remotely to assist in filling out the petitions for the petitioners. it still is very difficult because the processes are changing still every day. Not necessarily in our courtroom, but really anywhere and everywhere. You know, what might be in person in one courtroom is Zoom in another. What might be e-filing in one courtroom is not e-filing in another. We have a different, even within Wayne Circuit, a different filing system for almost every division. So it is very complicated, and the need for the pro bono assistance from the bar is greater now more than ever. And I volunteered when I was a city attorney, when I first started practicing my first few years. First Step opened their residential center in the city of Wayne, and I was a city attorney there, and I went to the grand opening, and you know, it didn't take much more for me. I signed up that day, and it's some of the most meaningful work that I've ever done in my career. So, you know, I know we don't always draw a lot of people from the bar here to hear about what opportunities they are, but we do record, and they do end up seeing it, and those types of occasions to help and assist and do pro bono, really, I cannot describe how much they've enriched my career, not only as an attorney, but now as a judge and doing what I do, and in all facets of my life, as you know, a mom, a sister, a relative. We just see the issue in so many places that really understanding the process, answering the questions of why didn't they leave, what, you know, I just today in a hearing, I had a case where it was just horrible violence, and you know, I just really couldn't believe here we are years later, and there's a PPO, and there's police reports, and there's just a plea on it, and the first thing the attorney says is, you know, there is no record here of any violent, you know, and you know, the record is not what most people think the record is. So really understanding the process and why people don't just leave, and why they don't just report things, and why they don't get a PPO brings us, I think, really to, you know, just the need for greater resources, a greater understanding. Judge McCarthy, who was the presiding in domestic relations division before I was there for many, many years. And when I first joined, she said, one thing that I make all of the judges do is attend a national training for domestic violence. And, you know, here I was, I'm like, okay, well, I have like a 2-month-old baby, but I'll make it out to Massachusetts. And it was one of the greatest things that I've done in my career with regards to training, to sit in a room and really understand and put yourself in this place. I mean, it was emotionally riveting and just so just exhausting, really, to hear all of the statistics and day in and day out for 3 days. But it changed the way that I think about things. It changed the way that I judge cases. It changed how I hear evidence and how I understand and process it. So the training and the resources are just so vitally important. And so, again, I thank you guys for always putting this on and helping the bar understand the need for the pro bono work in this area.
Thank you so much, Judge Cox. Mr. Krantz, you can go next. How about that?
So I started my career in state prosecution in Mount Pleasant, Isabella County. And when you're new, you handle a lot of different kind of cases. I had a window peeping jury trial, believe it or not. But eventually started handling, you know, sexual assault, domestic violence, murder cases, things like that. And we also would handle PPO violation hearings. So we didn't really get involved in helping the victims get PPOs. But if there was a violation, we would prosecute the violation. And, you know, sometimes the behavior that led to the violation wouldn't be a new criminal offense either. It would just be something relatively minor to an outside viewer, but somebody who's been stalked or harassed, obviously it's a big deal to them. And I had one of these PPO violation hearings coming up, and the day before, the victim showed up at our office, no appointment, and said, hey, I want to talk to the prosecutor that's handling this. And so I didn't have anything going at the moment, so I said, absolutely, come on in. And we met with her, and we arranged who she was going to bring to court because she had a couple witnesses, her new boyfriend and her niece. And in the time that I worked there, the court was in the same building as our office, but they had built a new building next door, so it was a short walk across the parking lot. But anyway, I met with her the next day. She calls and she says, hey, you want me to come to your office again and we walk to court together, or should I meet you there? And had she not come the day before, I would have said, come to my office first. Well, she showed up and the guy killed her and her 2 witnesses in the parking lot of the courthouse with a shotgun. And I would have been with them had she not come in my office the day before. So, and the violation itself wasn't even real serious. So it was not anything anyone could have predicted, but it really struck home how important DV cases are to me when this happened. I remember it was on the national news, 3 people killed in the parking lot, Isabella County Courthouse. And of course, you know, my mom's calling and she's like, you're quitting that job. I'm like, I am. And so anyway, eventually I got the job as an assistant U.S. attorney, and we spend a lot of time at the National Advocacy Center in South Carolina. When you first get hired, you got to learn all this new stuff that you don't know. And so I knew I was going to do Indian country prosecutions, and I went to a course there with all the other Indian country AUSAs from all over the country, and what a great resource these people still are. But I remember that it was a small group, and you were supposed to introduce yourself like today, and this woman said, I've been doing, you know, federal sexual assault and domestic violence cases in Indian country for 20 years, and I love it. And I thought, that woman's crazy, man. Those are hard cases. And now I feel exactly the same way that she does. I mean, it didn't take long, but I was surprised because a lot of times, you know, the victims do not act the way you'd expect. And I'm sure a lot of you know this already, but they don't report the abuse, or if it does get reported, they say it didn't happen later. They say it's their fault. They stay with the abuser. And there's a lot of reasons why these things happen that the batterer does, but it makes, you know, our job that much harder. And state court has, as soon as I left state court prosecution, they enacted these laws that allow prosecutors to use what the victim told the police as substantive evidence against the defendant. You still have to have the victim show up for court so that she's subject to cross-examination, but you know, that's hearsay that we would never be able to admit in federal court. It'd be nice if that got updated, but state court allows you to bring in domestic violence that the guy's committed against any victim within a 10-year period up to the point of, I don't know if it's the trial or the new offense, but again, you know, that's very difficult to get into in 404B situation in federal court. And I do have a lot of victims that don't want me to prosecute their abusers. I've had people tell me I'm ruining their lives, and, you know, there's a few that say, you saved my life too, which, you know, is very nice when that happens. But there are things that, you know, you can do, obviously, if you have good investigators. And I had one trial where the entire evidence was the body camera video from the officer the night of the incident when the woman was upset. So it was an excited utterance. She was crying and saying what happened. And the guy was not arrested. He had left before that, and he had broken her phone when she tried to call the police. So the officer got with the victim advocate's office, got a new cell phone for this woman, and brought it to her the next day. Like, if he shows up, call us so we can come get him and help you. And she said, by the way, you know, why don't you tell me again what happened? Well, now she's sober. So this excuse of, well, the things I said the night before, I was drunk. I didn't know what I was talking about. That didn't really happen. She repeated it, but now it's not an excited utterance. She's not upset. I was able to present to the judge that she indicated that she would never lie to get him in trouble because it's her husband and she loves him. So, you know, the flip side of that is whatever she said that hurts him must be true. And I was able to convince the judge to let us use the second video as the catch-all hearsay exception, which is rarely used. And that was my entire evidence, the first video and the second video. She got on the stand and said, I don't remember anything, I was drunk. And they convicted him. He got 5 years in prison. And some of the worst offenders that we've had in federal court, I've had an 85-year sentence on a domestic violence case. I got a 72-year sentence. I see Mr. Flanagan in the back. We're retrying that case. It's the first time I've ever had to retry a case, but the original judge didn't warn him enough about what a bad idea it was to represent himself was the essential reason it was reversed. So he's getting a new trial, but it's going to go the same way, hopefully. One thing that is really helpful in these cases that I found is we call a domestic violence or sexual assault expert witness to explain all of these things that the defense says is showing that this didn't happen. She flips it around and says, this is exactly what domestic violence victims do. She can't meet with the victim. She can't give an opinion about that specific case, but she's met with thousands of victims. She's testified, dozens of times, and she's able to say these are common characteristics, things that if you don't know domestic violence, you're not going to understand that this is actually indicative of somebody who's a real victim, someone that says it didn't happen later, and there's reasons for that, obviously. I found that in addition to that, the jail calls are a treasure trove of information. If you know that the guy knows her phone number, you can find, and we often charge, and in the case I'm retrying with Judge Parker, I think there's something like 8 witness tampering charges, and a lot of those have to do with jail calls that are recorded, where he's telling her, not to show up for court, or, you need to say this, or whatever it is. I don't remember all the details because there's so many of these cases. But I found that sometimes these guys, they realize I'm doing this, so they'll call from a different inmate ID. So then you have to search by phone number that's being called. There was one guy in particular where at the beginning of each jail call, it would say, state your name for the person you're calling. And you're supposed to say the name, and they give you about 4 seconds. He would say, plead the fifth. So that would be a call that would show up as an unanswered call where he's actually communicating with her. And we strung all those together for that trial. And she brought in letters that he wrote her where he's telling her exactly how she needs to testify. And anyway, getting off on some tangents here, but I think, obviously the purpose of this is to encourage people to participate in helping these victims. And these are some of the most desperate people that have been manipulated and brainwashed. And they, if they do finally decide that they need to leave their abuser, if it's a long-term relationship, that's the most likely time they're going to get murdered. There's a lot of tactics that the perpetrator can do, like, I'm going to take your kids, they're going to be mine. And then the victim worries about whether or not he's going to turn his abuse towards the children instead of her. They systematically isolate these victims from their families so they don't have a support system, and they don't know, how the legal system, typically, they don't know how it works. Just getting a PPO, I'm sure, can be very intimidating for people that are trying to figure out how to get that. Obviously, divorce, child custody, areas outside the criminal justice system where I could see where people would need a lot of help from attorneys. And who's controlling the finances in the house? It's not the victim, so they don't have any money to pay a lawyer for these kind of things. They may not have any housing. They may need someone to try and find resources for a shelter for short term, but also more permanent housing. They may need help with friend of the court or CPS. I mean, there's a lot of different areas that I can't really help them. Our advocate does a great job of getting them in touch with service providers for counseling and some resources if they need a place for a hotel for the night or a bus pass or something like that. There's some short-term fixes that our office and also the advocate for the tribe can help us with these things. But as far as these bigger areas, he's going to have a lawyer when he shows up for court at the PPO or at the divorce or at the child custody. And if she doesn't, it's not really a fair fight. So, I don't know, anybody have any questions for me about any of that or anything? Yes.
Maybe I should wait slow. But my question is this, Judge Cox, how does Wayne County the circuit court uses services of private lawyers in domestic violence. And I understand that that's a big part of your docket, and Mr. Krantz, it's a big part of your docket. We don't have those dockets. We might have a supervised release case involving domestic violence or what kind of defendant with domestic violence in his background. But generally, we don't have the kinds of cases that would lend themselves to lawyers providing services of domestic violence. So how would we as judges encourage, and what is the type of service you ask volunteer lawyers to provide?
Yeah, so great question. So we refer people both in domestic relations and PPO cases to Lakeshore Legal or the William Booth Legal Aid Clinic when we believe that there is a need for some representation. And we have a liaison who works in the domestic violence division of the clerk's office. And so those that liaison will put people into contact with the available resources and the available attorneys providing pro bono work. The problem really is now, again, the volume that we're seeing and the availability of the attorneys in the pro bono clinics can only do so much. So the need really is so much greater than, just what Lakeshore and William Booth can provide directly, because they can only handle so many cases. First Step will also sometimes allow. So what I would do as an attorney is volunteer as a pro bono attorney for First Step, and First Step would then put me in contact with petitioners or plaintiffs or defendants or respondents who needed assistance because of DV issues.
Okay, we're going to come back to the questions. I'm going to call on Ms. Lowe.
All right. So thanks for having me. I was struck by hearing Judge Cox say 50% of your docket involves domestic violence. And struck because when I was a staff attorney at Oakland Livingston Legal Aid a long time ago, about 20 years ago, when I first met Judge Hood, I was doing a presentation at the Bench Bar Conference about domestic violence. And a lawyer who'd been practicing a long time at that point said to me in my little presentation, "Oh, I've been practicing for 40 years and I've never had a case that involved domestic violence." And what that said to me right then was, we don't get it. We're not asking the questions and we don't know what's out there. And things have gotten better. That's been 20 years. So I think it's on people's mind more now. But there are still lawyers in the family law bar who don't ask their clients about domestic violence, don't prepare them for what the impact of domestic violence is on their case. And so I want to talk a little bit about that. I have been practicing almost, more than 20 years, I'd like to say almost, as exclusively as a domestic violence advocate, and in a variety of different ways in a variety of different courts. But I am struck by how little has changed over that time, by how little has changed systemically and in the lives of our clients. And the need is enormous. Judge Roberts, you asked what happens for volunteers? How do we get them involved? One thing that happened during COVID was a lot of people, remember in the shutdown and nothing was happening? Our phone lines were essentially dead. Nobody was calling anybody. And volunteers came out, all kinds of lawyers came out and said, "How can I help? What can I do?" All those people were well-intentioned, but very few followed through. And I think that is a function of COVID. I think all of us are struggling with our own internal needs and trying to keep our kids in school and focused, and our own mental health just barely above the line. So it's fair, but there has been a drop-off in volunteer engagement. And so we could really use everybody's help in encouraging lawyers to take these cases. I wanted to make sure we covered a bunch of stuff, but I'm going to jump ahead and assume you know what domestic violence is, but I'm going to talk about why it's important. So probably you've seen this before. This is the power and control wheel that kind of identifies the different types of violence or abuse that batterers use. And you can see it's not just physical, right? It is emotional abuse. It's isolation, telling a victim, "You're the worst parent. I will take the kids away from you. You'll never see them again." Coercion, threats, economic abuse and control so that the survivor has no idea what the finances are. Can't tell you how many clients have said, I do not know. I don't know how much my partner makes, and I don't know what we own. And so there's just no way of knowing what your assets are and your abilities are. And so it's important to know, if I had a couple, that having a lawyer makes a huge difference, right? So when all these tactics that an abuser uses, the financial control, the emotional abuse, a lawyer can change that. A lawyer can take a case that is very often a legally simple case. It's a divorce. It's a division of assets, but it is complicated for the victim. There's nothing more complicated than that because they're afraid all the time and they're working from a place of trauma. So the idea that they could handle a case on their own, even if it's simple legally, is really just missing the mark. And so what lawyers can do is counteract those tactics of abusers and change the dynamic and change a survivor's life. So in terms of financial abuse, making sure that the survivor has adequate child support, getting a good spousal support order, or sometimes bankruptcy to take care of debt and sweeping that person's debt away so that they can start with a clean slate and they're not leaving a marriage in an economically strapped situation. Talking about emotional abuse, giving support to that survivor, and also understanding that they're coming from a place of trauma and helping to support them through that, right? Recognizing, hey, this is what this person's been telling you, but let me tell you, that's not the way it is. Just because somebody has money doesn't mean they get the kids. Doesn't mean they get all the things that come out. And those are the stories that survivors have been told. Of course, there's physical abuse, and we help people get personal protection orders and encourage enforcement of those protection orders and do safety planning. We talk a lot about avoiding the situation that Roy just described in that shooting in the parking lot. That is my worst nightmare. And I have said to dozens of clients, I know you're not afraid of this happening, but I am. And so I'm going to take some steps. I'm going to have the deputy walk you out to your car. And I know you don't think you need it, but we're all going out together. And I'm not going to leave you alone in the courthouse. And I send either myself or somebody else with the client so they're never alone. Every courthouse has corners that are dangerous for a survivor of domestic abuse. So we talk about those things. When there's a threat to kill, we don't ignore it. We call the police immediately and escalate things up. And that escalation really changes things. That putting things out in the public and calling abusers out on their abuse can start to reduce the level of violence in that relationship. Just in terms of things that lawyers can do, changing the message on emotional abuse, doing the safety planning. Very common tactic of an abuser is to abuse the legal process, filing tons of motions, tons of discovery motions, things that are going to get just denied, but they filed all these things just to waste their time and to run up their legal bills. So we get protective orders. We object to mediation because very often survivors are not in a good place to advocate for themselves or be in that collaborative process that's necessary for mediation to take place. We work on economic stability, making sure that there's fairness, and that sometimes I had a case one time where really there was nothing at issue except for the finances, and we ended up getting about 75% of the assets for our client who was a survivor because of the damage that the batterer had done to their credit. And so they were really starting in a bad financial place. And instead of most of the time you get about a 50-50 split of assets, we did a shift in that balance so to compensate for that because there wasn't really much money otherwise. Another thing that happens is abusers engage in post-judgment manipulation. So never picking the kids up on time, leaving the survivor waiting in the parking lot at McDonald's where they're doing their exchange for hours, waiting for things to happen. So we get orders that are very specific and say, this is who can be there, this is how long we'll wait, this is the location, and it's in public, it's not in somebody's house where some abuse can happen. So setting up those structures so that there's not room for abuse once the lawyers are out of the picture. So we tell all the lawyers who agreed to take our cases that the reason is because it makes a difference. it makes a difference in somebody's life in a huge way, and can really be the difference between a life of poverty that cycles through or ending that life of poverty and moving into stability. Having a sound financial footing when they leave and protection from abuse can change the way the rest of their life goes and their children. So it's not just a blip, it's not just a moment, it is life-changing, this work. Lawyers have that expertise and the ability that clients don't have, and that they're really at a disadvantage. So bringing that to it to kind of balance that power. And the things that we do to support volunteers. We do trainings, we talk about trauma-informed practice, we talk about the nuts and bolts of family law practice. We bring in judges and their clerks to talk about how to manage at the courthouse and the process to follow. And we provide as much support as we can so that the cases are not so burdensome, but allow lawyers to do the good work that they do where they have a huge impact on our clients. And I will just end by sharing our website where folks can go to volunteer. And our director of pro bono is Heather Herbert, and she is always looking for people to take cases. I do want to give one example of a case that happened because of COVID. We were seeing, when everything shut down and nothing was happening. And I was interviewed a couple times by newspaper reporters who said, I've heard domestic violence is gone down during the shutdown. And well, how do you know? Nobody knows the court is open. Even though people didn't know they could go get help. And so we had a case where a batterer took the kids and said, the kids were with our client. She had a barbecue with her sister, and the sister got COVID. So the abuser said, well, you've got to take them to get tested and make sure they're okay. And this was early on in COVID. So they had to go to the hospital to get tested. And they did, and they were fine. And then he went to court and said, oh, she's endangering them. And it's evidenced by the fact that she had to take them to get treatment for COVID. And so she should not be allowed to see the children because she's putting them in danger. And so in this very fraught time, when everybody was so afraid for their safety, and everybody was just trying to do the best that they could, he had set up this situation where he set her up to be endangering the children. And luckily we were able to get in on an emergency motion virtually, of course, and had in the court enforced parenting time and the return of the children. But it's that kind of manipulation. When there's an opportunity and a vulnerability, abusers take advantage of it. And that's the kind of work that the lawyers need to do to help get involved, to help survivors.
Thank you, Ms. Lowe. Let's go back to some questions that you might have. Yes. Tell us your name too.
I also wanted to introduce myself because everybody in this room knows each other. My name is Thomas. I work for an investigative firm in Troy. And we only do digital forensics with a forensic lab. We do pro bono work in the DP space where we preserve cell phones, grabs off social media. In the case of a snap phone, they didn't even know it was being backed into the cloud. We help attorneys. So I just wanted to introduce myself and say it's an honor to be here. And also, have you had the opportunity or the need for forensics, based on kind of the periscope that you do?
We definitely do. We have the FBI on our side, so they can usually.
Kind of a big name.
Yeah.
Good resource.
Yeah.
They don't have the capacity.
Right. Right. The state police do a good job too. I mean, a lot of my cases start with local law enforcement, tribal police, city police. But in Mount Pleasant, because of the reservation being there, it's so large, it's 212 square miles, and it encompasses a lot of the city. So the jail and the courthouse, the county courthouse, is in Indian country. And I think that's why I have such a large, robust practice. I mean, there were times that with my one tribe, I was doing more cases by myself than the Western District with their 11 tribes. So all of our officers, due to a federal lawsuit that was settled around 2009 with Judge Ludington, our judge in Bay City, are all, in theory, tribal officers, sheriff's deputies, and federal officers. So any officer can deal with any suspect or victim. They don't have to call in the tribal police if they pull someone over and realize that we're dealing with Native American people here. So it doesn't always work out that way. You know, we teach the federal certification class where they have to pass the, you know, the BIA test, but then there has to be an adjudication of their background, even though they're already law enforcement. It's a special person that has to, you know, go through their background, make sure that they can be BIA officers. And sometimes that doesn't happen real timely. And so I'll get calls from City PD and say, we need a search warrant. I'm like, who's there with the BIA certification that can swear it out? Nobody. Well, then you're not getting a search warrant from federal court. So luckily we do have a BIA officer that's embedded with our drug team over there. So he steps up and helps. Now we have a current FBI agent in Indian country that actually has his office in the tribal police department. So it's better now than it has been in the past, but it is nice that we can, you know, rely on either state police or FBI or possibly BIA, although they're mainly focused on drug investigations in our area. I know it's different out west, but.
Okay, anybody else? Yes?
I have a question. This is actually also for you, Roy, because I was going to talk to you on Thursday.
Okay.
When I see you, but I just so happened to see your Dateline appearance just last night.
Oh, the deadline with Cameron Hall?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And because I saw you were a panelist, I said, well, then I'll
Nice.
watch the show. So to that though, I want to ask you a couple questions. How much, if at all, were you involved in the orchestrating of this scheme that ultimately tricked him into
And the
location of the body?
So this case, just for background, this was a long-term relationship. The defendant, this is in state court too, by the way, before I became an AUSA, but this defendant had abused his girlfriend a number of times. There were at least twice where he was in jail, couldn't post bond, and he said that the prosecutor knew that the victim was going to recant, which is very common and doesn't mean it didn't happen, obviously. So they say, hey, look, you know, plead to the domestic violence, we'll give you no more jail, you can get out today. So he did a couple times. The third time was a felony because he's got 2 priors. This is state court. Same with us, but you have to have very specific priors for us to charge a felony. So anyway, he's in jail and he demands a prelim. A lot of defense attorneys will waive the preliminary examination. It has to happen within 14 days. It happens quickly, but he's, you know, oh, I'm going to make her testify. She'll never testify against me. Well, early in the case, the victims are often on our side. So she came in and told the truth and he got bound over. And then eventually he came up with bond from a friend and he posted bond, he got out and he told someone like, if I kill her, she won't be able to testify at trial and I won't go back to prison. So she disappears and she's gone for like 60 days and we all know he killed her, but you know, there's no proof. And so the detectives in Isabella County decided to basically hold some phony press conferences. Like, of course, the media didn't know, but they would say, we're going to have a press conference, and a bunch of media people would show up, and they'd say, we're getting close to solving this case. We have a person of interest, and we're closing in quickly. And by the way, in the meantime, he went to trial on the DV 3rd, and because the witness was unavailable, the prosecutor was able to use her former testimony at the prelim where he had a defense attorney which could cross-examine the victim. He was convicted without the victim showing up for trial. Judge Ludington, our federal judge, was a state judge at the time. It was his case. The guy was a habitual, so it was up to 15 years. He gave him 3.5 to 15 years on a case where the victim didn't even show up. So he's in prison. Our detectives are working the homicide, and they basically are creating the illusion that they're closing in on him. They'd call her 20-year-old daughter to come talk to the media, and she'd say, you know, hunters, when you're out in the woods, if you see anything unusual, tell the police. And so they cut out these newspaper articles with the girl at the podium, and they mailed them to him in prison just to keep him worried about the case. So he gets them, and he doesn't know who they're coming from, and he tells his cellmate, I need to have this killed, the daughter, because she's keeping the police hot on my trail. And so the guy that he's in prison with was actually a decent guy. He was in there for some financial thing, and he's like, I got to do something. So he goes, I got a brother in a motorcycle gang that does hits, and he's like, bring him in, I want to meet with him. So they send in this undercover cop who looks like a bad, scary guy. He goes in and meets with him, but when he goes to the prison, he doesn't tell any of the guards he's a cop or what he's doing, because you don't know who you can trust, even if they're guards. So the warden knows who he is. The warden set this up. He goes in one time and meets with them, and he says, hey, you want me to kill this girl? I can do that. You're going to have to kill people for us when you get out. Is that a problem? No, that's no problem. I've done it before, because you don't have enough money to pay us. And he's like, when I get rid of a body, I pour acid on it. It eats everything up. You never have to worry about getting caught. You want me to clean up your mess on the other one? Guy's like, no, man, they're never going to find her. It's been 60 days. And he's like, that's fine. I'm not going to push you. He goes back to the cell and he says, what your brother said? And the guy says, you told him, no, you got to do that, man. You're going to get out. Some raccoon's going to dig her up. And all of a sudden you're back in prison. So he's like, all right, bring him back in. So the first recording that, by the way, the cop snuck in a recording device into the prison in his cowboy boots. It didn't work out real good. Like, you couldn't hear it. I mean, if he told you what was being said, then you could make it out, kind of thing. This time he took 2 recording devices and he set off the metal detector. So the guards are like, take off the boots. So he's like, oh crap, So he sits down and he's slowly taking the boots off, and the warden's watching from her office. And she calls the guard, the guy with the cowboy boots, he's good, let him in. So they let him in. He records this guy leading him right to the body. Because the theory is we're going to put both bodies together, and then we're going to, try and disintegrate the bodies. But if we're unsuccessful and they realize this daughter was killed when you were in prison, they'll never suspect you on the first one because they're in the same hole, right? So he leads them right to the body. The police go out to this wooded area near Midland. I get lost every time I mountain bike there. There's got to be 50 miles of single track and another 20 of 2 tracks. And they go out there with a hand shovel, and in the winter with snow on the ground, they dig 1 hole and they find her. That's how good his directions are. Wow. And so they went back and confronted him. They excavated the body, and I had 2 different, somebody from down here, I can't remember his name, but a couple medical examiners examined the body to see cause of death. Well, she was deteriorated enough from being buried that they couldn't, come up with anything definitive. But at the time, this is another little side shoot story, but there's a guy in Midland County that the law enforcement doesn't like, and he got charged with home invasion. And the home invasion was, he was with his kid, the kid runs out in front of a car, the car can't stop, hits the kid dies, and he's upset because the prosecutor didn't charge the driver for killing his son, which the driver wasn't drunk or anything, couldn't stop because the kid ran out in front of him. But that night he was so upset that he broke the neighbor's window and was taking pieces of glass and throwing them at the guy in bed, cutting him up. So they charged him with home invasion. He hires a defense attorney who later becomes the prosecutor during the pendency of that case. They know I live in Midland and work in Isabella, so they say, hey, can you handle this case for us? Yeah, no problem. So I come over and I realize this guy's in a cell with our murderer before we found the body. And he says he'll wear a wire and everything in the jail cell, which we had to really look into to see if we could even do that. But eventually, he wants to cooperate against, and he tells us that Schultz, the murderer, he asked him, where's your girlfriend? He said, she's in Florida. And he's doing the strangulation kind of, like I strangled her without saying it. And so we wanted him to testify, but in the same time, he also picked up a drug case. Midland County prosecuted him on that, but wouldn't give me that case to handle because he didn't have the same defense attorney who became the prosecutor, so they didn't have a conflict. They wouldn't work with us on giving the guy a deal globally on his cases to help us solve this murder where the body was found in their county. And so This is true. I swear to God, this is true. I called the sheriff up because this guy wanted 3 things to cooperate. He wanted a letter to the parole board for him, a letter to the parole board for his son, and he wanted this Bobcat, which was, the little excavating machine, because his son used to drive it around the property, had sentimental value. The sheriff had not only seized it, but forfeited it as part of this drug case. I have no idea the details on how he could forfeit that, but I called up the sheriff at the time, the elected sheriff in the county I lived in, and I said, hey, I'm the chief assistant in Isabella. I'm prosecuting this case where the body was found in your county, where the defendant lives in your county, and we need this Bobcat for Ronnie Fredrickson to testify for us. And he says, I'd rather lose that case than give you the Bobcat back. We hate that guy.
Oh my gosh.
So the chief assistant in Midland County at the time, who's now deceased, so he won't mind me telling me the story, but he kind of, bluffed the sheriff. He said, hey, I just want to give you the heads up, the family of the victim's going on TV this weekend. They're trying to raise money to buy that Bobcat from you. Probably bad press for you, but I thought I'd give you the heads up. I'll give him the Bobcat. So we got the Bobcat, and then I made the crucial error of asking a question you don't know the answer to during the trial. How much is that Bobcat worth? Fredrickson's like, oh, that thing's worth $30,000. Everybody's telling me it's not worth anything.
Yeah.
So then the defense is like, this witness is bought and paid for by the prosecution. But we had people that testified that when he went to work a week before she disappeared, he's driving this unusual car and he's parking way in the back of the lot and they're out smoking, so they see it. And they say, what are you doing with that car? He goes, I didn't think I could fit her in the back of my hatchback. He had this little tiny hatchback car. So we found the rental agreement that he had rented a car to try and kidnap her and kill her before this. Yeah.
To that point, my next part of that question was going to be, and I guess it could also be for Judge Cox as well. In your opinion, could something, when he made bail after on the DD3rd, could something more have been done or something else put in place to have prevented it from happening to begin with?
I mean, that, the system, unfortunately, is so reactionary that I'm not sure that, what's the PPO worth? It's, or the bond condition worth?
Right.
Yeah.
It's the bond conditions of the PPO. Beyond that, there was no suggestion that maybe additional protection was needed.
I wasn't a part of that DV case. That was in Midland County, and I worked for Isabella. I only handled that Fredrickson case because of the conflict. So I only learned about the DV after the murder, and the only reason I was involved in the murder is because she disappeared into my county and later was found dead in another, which you'd think would be a problem with venue, but we were able to get the state attorney general to designate our county as the appropriate county, not knowing where she had actually died. But I think other than asking the police to make rounds through her neighborhood periodically, but when I get threatened, that you hardly ever see the police. They say they're coming through your neighborhood to check on you, but I mean, I don't know. So I don't know that there's.
Can we let Judge Cox weigh in
Yeah.
on what she
Yeah.
might order that might help that situation?
Yeah, so I think, bond in and of itself is like a whole day that we could, address the issues with that. But, we'll often do a tether. We'll put a tether on somebody if we really do think that they're going to make bond and that there is a higher level of threat involved. Part of the problem really is, just as Roy pointed out, you do not know when these situations are going to escalate from something that seems minor to just the end. And it's so difficult to be able to weigh that in a short period with very little evidence. Again, hence the need really for advocates and legal advocates to assist. I probably told this story when we were on the panel before, but there's a lot, to be said about a PPO, and it's a piece of paper, and what is it really going to do? And the truth and reality is somebody has an intent to murder somebody or do great bodily harm, it's probably not going to steer them from doing that. However, it criminalizes what is otherwise minor or non-criminal behavior. So I had a situation where a petitioner was, she had a PPO against the respondent, and she had ended the relationship, and she got the PPO because he just wasn't understanding that. And months had gone by and there was no contact and the PPO was working, and she left for work and she really thought she saw his vehicle in her neighborhood. So when she was coming home from work, she was worried enough that she called the police and said, I think that I saw this vehicle in my neighborhood and I have a PPO against this person and I haven't seen him in months, but I think it was his vehicle. And they, normally wouldn't come out, right? It's not a crime to be in front of somebody's house or in somebody's neighborhood, but they said, okay, we're able to see your PPO. They're not allowed to be at your home. We're going to come out and just see if we see this vehicle anywhere. So they did not see the vehicle, but they offered to go into the home of the victim with her, and they looked through the whole home, and everything seemed fine. And while they were just about to leave, one of the officers opened the kitchen cabinet, and he was in there with a machete, hiding in the kitchen cabinet. That piece of paper saved her life. There is no doubt that day. So, it's difficult to get to the point where you want to get that piece of paper because put yourself in the place of a victim or a survivor. I mean, even if you've gotten away, this paper is probably going to aggravate things and you have to serve the PPO. And so sometimes it's so daunting to go through that process. And when you're weighing the pros and cons, I think so often it just seems like it's going to make things maybe worse. But it can be effective in so many situations. It doesn't prevent a lot of the very bad situations, but sometimes it does. And for that reason, the call becomes a crime, the contact becomes a crime, appearing within the sight of someone is a crime. So, it in some circumstances does work. Other than that, really the tether is the biggest thing that we will use if somebody is out on bond, and bond conditions.
So you all know, I unfortunately, maybe fortunately, I'm old enough to remember, I don't know if you remember this, you didn't used to be able to get a PPO at all. I mean, you had to have something really physically happen to you in the daylight with a crowd in order to get a PPO. In fact, you couldn't get the police to come. You would call and my husband's beating me up and basically you were at the bottom of the list. And so those were some very progressive things at the time they came into being used, that you could actually call the police and the police were required to come if you reported domestic violence, and then you could go get a PPO. And while that's a little bit more complicated now, back then that really was a device that was thought to at least separate you from whoever was battering you at the time. And I know it's much more complicated now, but back then it was really progressive. Are there any other questions? I think, Crystal, are you telling me I have 1 minute left or no minute? 1 minute left. Okay, Kim.
Cox, do you know what happened to the man with the machete?
So he had much bigger issues beyond the PPO after that. So he was charged criminally. And I think actually when we arraigned him on the violation, he went, straight over to Frank Murphy for arraignment on criminal charges. So he was ultimately charged with assault to do great bodily harm with intent.
Okay, anyone else? Okay, well, Judge Roberts raised a good question. Why are we, the federal government, the federal courts, doing this? And this was an act by Congress. And I think in the beginning, people thought, why are we doing it? We don't really have hardly anything domestic except in supervised release or probation violation or pretrial violation settings. But the goal was to, like we have in all kinds of pro bono cases, I had the lawyers once come and we were doing a prisoner pro se, get lawyers to represent them, and some patent lawyers said, we just do patent law. And I told them, I said, that means you're really smart, so this will be a piece of cake for you, right? And they brought their lawyers and were trained, and for a long time were really good advocates in the prisoner civil rights setting. And so this is kind of like that. We know that in federal court, we get some of the best lawyers that come through our courthouse. And so we hope they'll look at this video if they, because few are here, but of the attorneys, but they have the chance to look at the video and be encouraged that there is somewhere that they could go to volunteer to do this kind of work. That's really maybe different from the commercial litigation that they do, or employment law, or whatever might bring them into our courthouse rather than to the circuit courthouse where you have domestic violence. And so I hope those who may be watching will be inspired to come out. I know that Ms. Lowe her group will make sure you get the appropriate training to go into court and help people who come through the court. And if you know people who are suffering in those kinds of situations, there's services on both ends, so that if you contact Lakeshore, they will let you know what kind of programs that they have to help people who are afraid to leave their battering spouse, and those people who are doing the battering as well. So I would like to thank all of our participants, Ms. Lowe, Mr. Krantz, and Judge Cox for coming out again this year. And I thank all of you for being willing to attend and to learn more about this kind of a plague in our country. And I can understand how it would rise. I mean, those of us who have been home working remotely know that it's a little bit different test to be in the same house with all your kids and your husband all together all the time. Usually at least somebody is at school, somebody might be at work, somebody's doing some volunteering, but now that we have people that are kind of all cooped up, it gets to be a little bit more of an issue. Tempers get to be a little bit more short, and we have to be very careful not to act on those kinds of things. So thank you all for coming, and remember, there are lovely snacks over there. I hope you'll take advantage of it, and I hope you'll tell anyone you see that said you went there, what happened. You can tell them that it was recorded, and they can look it on the video, the blessing of which is they can fast forward when they're interested, and they can back it up if they want to hear something again. Okay, thank you all for coming.
All right, thank you.